This oral history records Professor Gordon Hughes' contributions in the field of magnetic recording technology at Xerox and at Seagate, and as a successful researcher and educator at the Center for Magnetic Recording Research, a joint university industry research center at the University of California at San Diego. He is credited with advancing the technology development of hard disk drives and their early product development at the start of Seagate Technology in the early 1980s, where he made major contributions to Seagate's success. He is also the author of a personal adventure novel relating events in his career, especially those at Seagate Technology, entitled Hard Drive, As the Disk Turns. My name is Ron Dennison, and I will be conducting the interview. So Gordon, tell us about your family background, where you were born, grew up, and received your early education.
I was born in West Los Angeles to an attorney father and a mother that managed the personnel department of a department store. And I went to public schools in West Los Angeles, Hamilton High School. And for college, I applied to and was admitted to Caltech. And so I lived in Pasadena through my undergraduate years, and I took my graduate years also at Caltech. And I got a Bachelor of Science in Physics at Caltech and also a PhD in EE.
Okay, let's move back a little. We're going to talk more about your higher education, but what were some of the things that interested you while you were growing up in LA?
Well, I early became interested in electronics. I was a ham radio nut. I had a general class license, W6QBI. I learned a lot about electronics. Throughout high school, I built electronic kits, transmitters, and that's my major hobbies.
Okay. Let's move forward then and talk about Pasadena and Caltech. Did you apply to other schools besides Caltech?
I had a backup plan, of course, the UCLA, which I didn't need to use, and that was it.
Tell us a little about your Caltech experience. I understand that Linus Pauling and Richard Feynman were there then.
Yes, that was a part of the undergraduate experience that the current Caltech students wish they had. I had gotten terrified of the difficulty of the courses at Caltech due to a Time magazine article at that time. This is about 1955. And I actually studied the calculus math courses by going through its textbook all the summer vacation before I went to Caltech. And as a result, I was the highest scoring on math test at Caltech when I went there. But Professor Linus Pauling gave the chemistry lectures to the freshmen at those years. We were about 100 or so of us sitting in rows in the chemistry theater, all wearing slide rule holsters on our belts, and most of us wearing glasses. And we were, of course, in awe of Linus Pauling. He'd gotten his first Nobel Prize by that time. The second one on ending atomic testing in the Earth's atmosphere was to come later. And he would peer over his bifocals at us and smile tolerantly at his boys. And he would occasionally do unusual things, pulling out a 6-inch slide rule and reading off atomic lattice constants of various minerals. And he would read them off to 6 significant figures, which amazed us because we knew that an analog slide rule was only good to 3. And we would afterwards try to figure out what he was doing, and none of us realized until years and years later that he possessed an interesting character of a really good teacher, which is showmanship. And he just, those lattice constants were only known to 3 figures. You could look them up in the physics textbook. He added the other digits to amaze us and keep us interested in what he was saying.
And Feynman.
Richard Feynman was also present. And my best Feynman story was he once gave a Wednesday evening demonstration lecture, and these were open to the Pasadena public. And I was sitting near a couple of typical Pasadena white-haired grandmothers. And he gave this lecture on quantum mechanics, and it was fascinating. All of his lectures were fascinating because he was very good at being prepared to be entertaining in this case. And on the way out of the lecture, I heard one of these Pasadena ladies saying to the other, I never realized that quantum mechanics was so simple until Professor Feynman explained it to us. And I knew that they had not the slightest grasp of quantum mechanics, but he had convinced them, and I thought that was absolutely marvelous. He would come to the student houses and sometimes play bongo drums for us, and he would tell us stories of his career in the atomic bomb project of World War II at Los Alamos. He would talk about picking safe locks, locks on safes, and he would send letters back and forth to his wife in Albuquerque with coded letters, which drove the security people in Los Alamos crazy. But he did it because he thought it was funny, and we all loved him for it.
Can you talk a little bit about your PhD work at Caltech? What work you did and what project and who funded it?
When I started, there was a research effort going on depositing permalloy thin films on glass substrates and studying the magnetic properties of these films. So I started trying to do that, and I was rapidly convinced that I should not further break the equipment. And so I made a discovery, which has been important throughout my life. Discovery was what I wanted out of this graduate school, which is I wanted out with a PhD. And so I rapidly discovered that I should do something in pure mathematics, which I did in threshold logic switching theory, which has application to computer logic, and I also applied it to pattern recognition, weather prediction. The only funding that's necessary for a mathematical thesis is for computer time, and at that time they had the first large-scale transistorized computer, the IBM 7094, and they also had Fortran. Fortran was then new. And so I got financial support for computing time to study the performance of these threshold logic networks.
Okay, what was graduate work and life like? Any interesting stories from that era?
Well, my office mate, Bob Harder, was an interesting character. He introduced me to the High Sierra Mountains, first by hiking and then by scaling these peaks. I believe I scaled 7 of the 14,000-foot peaks, rappelling down and hiking the John Muir Trail. And that's perhaps the most... I also bought an Austin Healey sports car, and I had a motorcycle that for some reason, I'd like to drive back to my house in West Los Angeles with my laundry so that my mother could do the laundry over the weekend, and I would go to Los Angeles via the riverbeds down the Pasadena, Rio Seco to the main LA River. I forget why I did that, but it was fun.
What Austin Healey? Which Austin Healey?
1955 Austin Healey sports car.
Oh, okay. My brother had a 100-6, so I'm kind of familiar with all the various
I no
models.
longer recall the exact model,
Okay.
but the best model was 1 year later. I remember that.
Okay. You did some very interesting work after Caltech, like working on the Minuteman missile system. Can you talk about that and the hard disks and so forth?
I had a job during my graduate school years with a disk drive company in Burbank. Libroscope was its name. They made very large format 20-inch diameter disks for the Navy, and they were put in submarines. They were gigantically bigger than, say, 2 refrigerators back to back, and they stored about 5 megabits is all they stored.
These were head retract.
And when I got my degree, they couldn't match the salary, the offer that I'd gotten from Autonetics, which was the division of North American Rockwell that invented and built the Minuteman missile electronics, which was the very first integrated circuit and the very first integrated circuit computer. Integrated circuits came of life in that program because the government was willing to spend any amount of money for missile defense in the Cold War. And I first worked on a pattern recognition contract that I had gotten from the Air Force. And I did theoretical work, in fact, the best work I've ever done, in my own opinion, on statistical pattern recognition, published in the IEEE Journal on Information Theory. But then I wound up working on the missile itself, on radiation hardening. And this idea was the notion, the Cold War notion that the Russians, if a war started, they might prevent the Minuteman missiles from launching by pin-down attacks, exploding atomic weapons above the silos. And so it was important to try to make the electronics resistant to such radiation. And I found a electronics box near the tail of the missile that had been overlooked. Most of the work had been concentrated on the integrated circuits in the computer, which was in the nose cone and was about the size of a shoebox. It had something like 32 kilobytes of memory on a disk drive that, oddly enough, used perpendicular recording, which was unheard of at the time, but it was possible to build a very ruggedized disk drive to survive the launching environment. And I discovered that down in that box near the tail of the rocket was a DC transistorized amplifier that controlled the steering vanes of the missile, the carbon steering vanes. And that I did an analysis on what would happen to the transistors and needed a current limiting circuit in the to prevent overcurrent that might destroy the transistors. And I did that until the entire company fell into a lost contract with the Air Force problem that resulted in mass layoff. And so I just left and went back to the disk drive company, or the disk drive people that I had been working with in Burbank. They were now in El Segundo, working for a company called Scientific Data Systems that was making mini computers, and this group was making 14-inch disk drives for the mini computers.
So that was Scientific Data Systems.
That was Scientific Data Systems.
Okay. So then you were out of the defense business. Was Scientific Data Systems related to Xerox, or how did that Xerox connection happen?
I should say that one of the happiest moments in my work with Autonetics was turning in all of my document chips, the top secret document chips, that you as a worker, you don't know what will happen to you if you leave the company and you haven't turned in all of them. But having been relieved of having any more top secret documents was a major pleasure. Just before I went to this small company, SDS, it had been bought by Xerox, which was attempting at that time to try to grow out of its traditional copying business, the analog copying business that it had invented, and into a computerized documenting processing, the environment that we all have today. So it had bought this mini computer company, Scientific Data Systems, but as in many other enterprises, Xerox really was a one-trick pony. It didn't know how to manufacture products beyond its original copiers. And so the original Xerox employees, the old-timers, called this activity of SDS that was Xerox's billion-dollar mistake. The founders of SDS were able to use the Xerox money to cash out their stock options, and they all left. The company with no founders. It was quite interesting.
Can you tell us about the technology of these disk drives?
Very common technology, which I'll call imitate IBM, plug-compatible IBM. What they were designing and what the group I joined was doing was similar drives to the IBM 2314 disk pack of that time. I designed the recording channels, the electronics, and the heads and the discs, recording heads. But they were standard technology that had been originated by IBM, and so were the discs. And that was essentially the job. It was designing recording channels.
Okay, when did the cobalt phosphorus thin film media come in?
It had, SDS had one interesting skill, manufacturing process that it had inherited along with the people that worked for Libroscope and Burbank. It brought over the manufacturing of thin film discs from Libroscope to SDS. And these discs were a cobalt alloy, a cobalt phosphorus alloy that was electrically plated onto aluminum substrates that had been given a hard layer by means of nickel plating, and then polishing, and then the cobalt phosphorus layer was put on top. That was the recording layer. And they were almost unique. There was only one or two people that made disk drives that used thin film media, and Xerox or Scientific Data Systems was one of the more successful ones.
Yeah, I should point out that at that time I was at Burroughs, and they were using also cobalt phosphorus.
Burroughs was one of the other ones, that's right.
Yeah.
It was a different variety, but it was a thin film cobalt-based disc. The benefit then and now was that essentially you could double the recording density without having to change too many other parameters, such as the flying height of the heads. That was important to the products that SDS was making. These were very large refrigerator-sized disk drives, 20-inch diameter disk still, and storing twice as many bits per disk that you could do with an iron oxide disk, a brown paint disk. That would turn out to be critical in getting this job at Xerox much later.
Can you talk about some of the interesting people you met at Xerox?
Well, the most interesting one was a researcher at Xerox PARC, of which this lab I was in Los Angeles that had been SDS. As I say, the principals left and the manufacturing failed, and so the lab I was part of became a research lab, and it was connected with the Palo Alto Research Center of Xerox. And Chen was a rather well-known and respected scientist doing magnetic work, but not magnetic recording. He was very much interested in the disk work that we did at SDS, and so he developed a sputtering process to make thin film disks using sputtering instead of electroplating. He was unable to convince Xerox to use it in manufacturing, and as I say, at that time, this division was running out of production opportunities anyway. And Tu did a very interesting thing. Chen left Xerox, started his own company, found venture capital financing, and he started a company called
COMAG
to make thin film disks, the sputtering process that he had invented. And he became remarkably successful. I say remarkably because it's rather unusual to find a researcher, a scientific researcher with business sense. But Tu did it. He formed a very successful company, which for many, many years was very profit-making on selling thin film disks to the disk drive industry.
So much has been written about Xerox's failure to make good on technology that they invested in, and including all the sorts of things that were developed at PARC. Can you tell us your views on their failure?
Well, Xerox once sent a manager to interview Chen at COMAG, and Tu, being Chinese, told him exactly what he thought in words that were barely printable. And I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say that Xerox had a talent for financing research, and it did a remarkable job in financing the Palo Alto Research Lab, PARC. It didn't put that technology into production, but Steve Jobs was around at Apple Computer, and he easily saw the power of the Alto computers that Park was constructing for its own internal use, and duplicated it and made the Apple Macintosh. So the technology became very useful in Apple, of course, now is the biggest computer in that industry. But Xerox made nothing of it. It only knew how to manufacture the one thing. It knew how to manufacture copying machines. It wasn't able to support 2 Chen in making thin film discs, and that was it. So Xerox was a good researcher, good supporter of research, but not manufacturing.
Okay. After Xerox, you state in your book that you had a choice between working for Seagate or for IBM. Can you say something about that choice? What led you to ultimately pick Seagate, and how you feel about that today?
Well, there was an interim where Xerox had closed my lab in a budget crunch, and I had consulted for Apple briefly on a floppy disk drive that they were manufacturing. And I was getting a little frustrated because when you work for yourself, you don't get medical pay, you don't get retirement, you don't get much of anything. And so I had an opportunity through a friend of mine, Bob Potter, to go interview at IBM Research in Elmendon Valley. And I went up and I gave him a paper, gave him some research on some of the magnetic theory that I'd done at Xerox, and they gave me a job offer. Simultaneously, a headhunter that I'd never heard of before found me and sent me to Scotts Valley near Santa Cruz to talk to the CTO of Seagate. Seagate was hardly a year or two into manufacturing its first disk drives, 5 megabyte, 5.25-inch disk drives, using conventional oxide disks and conventional ferrite recording heads. And Doug Mann, the CTO, offered me a job as a director of research to form my own recording group at Seagate to do recording channel design. I asked my friend Bob Potter which one I should take because, frankly, I thought that the IBM job sounded much more conservative. Seagate sounded a little dangerous. And he said it would be much more interesting to go to work for Seagate. And so I did. Fortunately, I didn't realize just exactly what that meant, exciting in a Silicon Valley company. But that's how I moved to Scotts Valley, took my wife up north, married her at that time, and started work. I brought many of the people that had worked with me at Xerox into this group to do recording technology at Seagate, and off we went. This was 1982, I think.
Okay. On the subject of people, you had the privilege of working with some of the most colorful personalities in the hard drive business in the early days at Seagate. Can you talk about them and some of the interesting stories?
Well, the most interesting story, of course, are Al Shugart. And I rapidly learned several things. I had to learn, of course, what the environment was in a Silicon Valley company. And the odd environment for a researcher type person like myself is that it is total teamwork. You just have to get used to it. It took me a while. And then anyone could talk to Al. In fact, many people would ask questions or try to solve management problems after work at Malone's Bar down the street from the small factory that was all of Seagate at that time. Al would talk to anybody. He was just a completely honest, open guy. And of course, he's famous for it. His idea was not to change technology. He was not even that much. He knew that technology was important, but the details were, once invented, would be known to everybody. That was the point he made with me from time to time. And but his trick was to want to make disk drives by the millions. They had been built by IBM rather like Boeing airliners, one at a time, and you sell them for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you make lots of money. Well, Seagate was going to sell them for $100 and make lots of money by making millions of them, and that was Al. And so, what would be a good Al story? Well, I remember once that I told Al that I had an opportunity to join a recording conference, the Arrowhead Conference, but that I would have to do a little horse trading when I got there. Everyone going to this conference from all the disk drive companies, such as IBM, would know that we were working on thin film disk recording at Seagate, and we were going to double the data density on our disk drives by means of it, and that the people at the conference would ask me about recording details. And I told Al that I would have to give up a few details, but that they would discover them anyway by experimenting a while, and that I would get good secrets in return. He just absolutely approved of that. He told me at Malone's bar, he said, "Go for it, Gordon." Another famous personality was Tom Mitchell. He was originally the vice president of production, and had been in the original meeting that had Tom Mitchell as production, Doug Mann as the future CTO of Seagate, Al Shugart as not just the president, but critically, the person with a respect in the disk drive industry that would be able to get venture capital money to help support Seagate. That would be Al's role. But of course, running the company as president. And of course, there was Finus Connor, who had the original idea for a 5.25-inch hard drive to fit in the same hole in a personal computer that was designed for the floppy disk drive, 5.25-inch floppy disk drive, and but store maybe 5 or 10 or 20 times as much data. That would be the marketplace. That was Finus's idea. And of course, you in Silicon Valley history, these are always drawn in the back of a cocktail napkin at a bar in Silicon Valley. And so that was the original story, and that's how Tom got to be production manager. And the famous story was that his background made him absolutely unforgiving of mistakes by anybody, because if you can't make disk drives for a few days because of some failure, the cost is many millions of dollars. And so Tom was famous for setting into anybody that failed to satisfy him and do his job properly. And he also had a Vietnam War hand grenade on his desk, and people would occasionally ask themselves or wonder whether it was a live hand grenade or a non-hand grenade. He was once had a story of jumping on the desk of a marketing guy, that one of Finus's people that wasn't satisfying Tom's questions, kicking every object off the man's desk except the picture of his wife, and asking the guy if he was going to listen to him seriously. That was Tom Mitchell.
You mentioned Doug Mann. Any interesting stories about Doug?
Doug was a good exponent because we were the direct contacts to the heart of Seagate. The heart of Seagate is the heart of a Silicon Valley company. The men that I told you that got together also discussed not only making a hard disk drive to replace a floppy, but they also discussed what would be the best kind of a Silicon Valley company. And as Doug later explained it to me, they decided to toss out every idea they had hated in every disk drive company they had ever worked for in Silicon Valley. That's what they did. And essentially, it was a totally open communication company. There was no secrets. Doug had a weekly meeting with his management staff, including myself, and we knew what the company was doing. We knew how well the thin film disk division, Xerox, was doing. We knew that IBM was going to buy our disk drives or not buy our disk drives. We knew everything because they believed in an open company, and Doug was an excellent exponent of that.
You brought up Xerox just now. Can you talk a little bit about Xerox and the Seagate relationship? And
when Seagate started, the venture capital people had no experience with disk drives for personal computers. They only knew about very expensive IBM disk drives for large, very expensive multi-million-dollar computers. And it was impossible for Finus or Shugart to get venture capital money. They were able to start manufacturing, anyway, because one of the smart features that Shugart did was to use standard components. He used standard recording heads, standard recording discs. Of course, he made the diameter 5 1/4 inches instead of 14, but that was a minor problem. And the discs had to be slightly redesigned. The disk drive heads had to be slightly redesigned, but there was no problem whatsoever, and it was very easy to get into volume production. And as soon as they did that, two things happened. They established a marketplace. This is Al's marketplace of let's make disk drives by the millions. Al also had one critical feature that I haven't mentioned, and that was open source technology. The recording channels were slightly different, but he made them all public. He gave the electronic diagrams to companies like Texas Instruments so they could design computers that used that had electronics to record on the disk drives. It was all open source, no secrets whatsoever. It's an Al Shugartism, and
so this was the genesis of the standard.
Okay, so at this point, Seagate is making money. Two things happen. One is that immediately he gets competition because other disk drive companies can do the same thing. But Shugart knows that if he's quick enough, he can take the money that he's making hand over fist and stay ahead of them. He can get his manufacturing costs low. That's the primary contribution of Tom Mitchell. And it makes it difficult for the competitors to make money unless they get to volume, large volume. And secondly, Shugart knew that he had to use the money he was making to go into an advancement in technology that his competitors wouldn't be able to easily follow. There were several possibilities, and he settled, and Doug Mann settled on the idea of replacing the oxide brown paint disc with thin film cobalt alloy disc. And by this time, he was able to get venture capital money for Seagate. The venture capital money people were completely happy with the profits they were making, and they were more than happy to sponsor a thin film disc division of Seagate. And they decided that it would be started as a separate company, that its leader, its president, Earl Blevis, called Greenix. They established a research facility, a disk making, small quantity disk manufacturing facility in Sunnyvale, and they started working on sputtering technology to make cobalt alloy discs. There was one mistake that was made in the business plan for this company, that what they were promising for Seagate was more profits on disk drives of far greater capacity, storage capacity, than the competitors could make with their brown oxide disks. The mistake was not only promising the thin film cobalt disc, but perpendicular recording on them, which is done today because the industry was able to develop recording heads that can properly get high recording densities on perpendicular recording discs. But that time in the 1980s, there was no such recording heads available. In fact, they didn't become available for several decades after that time. I told Doug Mann that this would be a problem, but there was an easy solution because of all my recording experience at Xerox with the SDS cobalt disc was with conventional recording heads on what's called longitudinal recording, and it allowed you to easily double the density on the disc with perfectly ordinary heads. And although it was in violation of Greenix's contract with the venture capital people, it would be a viable backup plan, and it would certainly not fail. That's what finally happened. But in any case, when you start a facility to make volume production of something like recording discs, it takes years to get the process clean enough and stable enough and low cost enough. It is agony. And it doesn't matter whether they're perpendicular discs or longitudinal discs. So on we went with the venture capital money. After several years, I'll call 3 or 4 years, the venture capital people got a little tired of waiting to make profits on it, and Shugart, who knew this backup disk story, bought them out. And on we went. Seagate was one of the first disk drive companies to have volume production of thin film discs, large volume production.
Yeah, there's a very interesting story in your book about the details of how that happened. So what were some of the important contributions that you made to Seagate's success, you personally, or your team?
Well, the most important feature that I brought to Seagate was simply an understanding that they could double their recording density without much difficulty whatsoever by using the disk. That sputtering technology would have a far superior future than the electroplated methods that we had used at Xerox. That Greenix's sputtering process was perfectly reasonable. I told them it wasn't going to be easy to bring it into volume production, and that I knew how to design recording channels that would double the density using conventional, and I knew how to make longitudinal media. We just had to change the alloy a little bit.
Now, so you were also scaling flying height, right?
You needed to scale the flying height a little, but that is part of disk drive technology anyway. It's part of its evolution. The flying heights get lower, the dimensions of the critical dimensions of the heads get smaller, but that's part of technology. It's nothing unusual, but it would have had to happen with the perpendicular disk or the longitudinal disk, and it just was an amount of energy that had to be expended, and it took a number of years and some clever inventions not only in the magnetic sputtering, but also in the electroplating of the nickel underneath. But it worked, and through the venture capital money and then finally the Seagate money, it became a division of Seagate Magnetics, and we ran it into large volume production. We took a 20 megabyte disk drive and just about instantly turned it into a 40 megabyte disk drive, selling for about the same price.
You mentioned the nickel plating underneath. Do you want to talk about the S.M.A.R.T story in the chemistry chain?
Well, we have been alluding to the difficulties in putting disk production in a successful volume, and one of the problems is simply getting an atomically smooth layer with no asperities. It seems like you're just putting a mere metal surface onto an aluminum disk, but the mirror has to be perfect. It has to be perfect to atomic dimension, to millionths of an inch. And so you need to have clean rooms and excellent clean room technology with people wearing bunny suits and masks. It sounds like the dreary details of production, but they're critical. They're absolutely critical. They're as important as the recording. And so you can't just put metal, cobalt metal on aluminum substrates. They're too soft. They will gall and wear and crash the heads. And so at Xerox and other places like Burroughs, it was known that you needed to put a hard metal layer on top of the aluminum and then polish it very, very smooth. That's electroplated nickel. And so that was fairly known, but the details of getting into clean volume production were not known. And in fact, it took a non-production, a non-technical step. I don't want to take credit for this, but I did go to Tom Mitchell, who's then he was in charge, still in charge of manufacturing. And I told him that Greenix had hired a bunch of research people who were trying to make disks with a research mentality, and that wasn't going to work. I told him to hire a mean-minded production guy. And he found one that was actually recording heads in San Diego. His name is Tom Maher, but he had exactly the right mindset. And we brought him into Greenix. We told him what the problems were. He started in the factory. He immediately noticed that clean room discipline was terrible. People weren't even wearing their masks, and nobody was enforcing the cleanliness. He fired the production supervisor right on the spot to get everybody's attention. They were terrified of him. Very interesting that this production guy was very much like Tom himself. People were terrified of Tom. Over the months that followed, the disc became flyable and recordable, and everyone wound up loving Tom Maher. It's quite remarkable. When I went over there, I would see him in the clean room wearing a gigantic white bunny suit with a bunny mask and everything, because he was a very big guy. His hobby was wrestling and weightlifting. And he was in there by himself, personally, as the president of Greenix. He was in there cleaning up, making the things clean. Well, anyway, it worked, and it just became flyable. and we went into volume production.
Okay. Any other Seagate stories that you want to relate before we move on?
Well, I did a few more things, but they're basically technical management. By that time, a number of disk drive companies, including IBM and Seagate, had formed the Center for Magnetic Recording Research, which wound up at UC San Diego, where it is to this day. And we would go down occasionally. We would interview students. They were being educated at this institute in the very technologies that you need to do disk drive development, in mechanics, in electronics, in signal processing, in physics. And I learned that a new recording channel had been developed by IBM called partial response recording, and my role was to bring it back into Seagate to demonstrate how it would work and to find out where to get the parts and how to use it and to educate the engineers in Seagate. And so we followed IBM and went into partial response recording.
Okay. Can you talk about your decision process for leaving Seagate and to join academia?
Well, as I mentioned earlier in this interview, I hadn't realized how exciting Seagate was going to be. I went through 3 major business cycles at Seagate. Gigantic booms where everybody's happy, and then there's a gigantic bust. At one point, IBM decided it was going to stop buying disk drives from Seagate. It was going to make its own disk drives. It cut up all the purchases, and it was the major company, the major customer of Seagate, 80% of the business. That caused a gigantic layoff, including more than half of my people, my engineers and researchers. And after my third recovery from that, I was at one of these twice-a-year meetings at CMRR, and its director, Shelley Schultz, approached me to take a job as an associate director and leave Silicon Valley. I didn't like that for a while, but I gradually learned that probably Jim Lemke had recommended me. He never admitted it, but Jim is a very smart guy. He knows he was probably behind my going to Seagate, is my guess. He probably got my name in there in the first place. And the result was that I had more than enough business cycles with Silicon Valley, and I was happy to go back to a job that looked like my Xerox research job of being out of production and out of business cycles, out of management. So I did.
Who were some of the people that you worked with at UCSD and CMRR, and who were there when you joined, and to what extent did they contribute to you joining UCSD?
Well, as I say, I think Jim influenced Shelley Schultz, the then director, to invite me in. When I went to Seagate, I became de facto in charge of all the recording technologies. That included the mechanical technologies, such as fly height, and I ran the computer programs that designed Seagate's recording heads for fly height, for example, something that's normally done by a mechanical engineer. And of course, I did the signal processing. That's done by a professor, Jack Wolf, at CMRR, who I was close friends with. And my basic recording physics background was naturally the same as that of Neil Bertram, so I worked with Neil. I actually taught parts of their several courses that they gave to undergrads on recording physics for Neil and on signal processing for Jack. I helped them run an experimental lab from time to time. And those were the main people that I worked with there.
You mentioned the experimental lab. What kind of projects did that take on?
These were essentially recording projects to give principally undergrads experience in actual magnetic recording, in reading and writing, adjusting recording currents, recording frequencies, looking at spectrum analyzers, that sort of thing. It was done on tape because it's more convenient and easy to do. And And signal processing is as a course is concerned, it's a mathematical, it's done on blackboards.
Okay. What were the dynamics of working with the folks at CMRR? I mean, how did that work on a day-to-day basis for you?
It's a remarkably friendly place. It's sort of, to me, it's the opposite of what I would have expected in basic academia. I think that basically, since everybody is involved with recording on tapes or discs or in general, all the people I'm working with understand that not only the technology of magnetic recording, but also the people involved and the companies involved. So basically, we're all like mind. And so, with the talk with Neil Bertram on recording physics, it is much easier to be comfortable with than abstract talk on pure magnetic physics, unrelated to recording. And so they're all very easy to get along with, and I was easily welcomed. They treated me very nicely.
What were some of the first projects that you worked on at CMRR or your grad students?
Before I went down, Shelley gave me a discussion on where the money comes from. And unlike all the companies I had worked for, you need to get grants in academia. You have to support yourself. The state of California, for example, only supports the salaries for teaching students at UC campuses. And he turned out that he could get a grant, or a several-year grant from the Sloan Foundation for something related to disc recording, but not just pure technology. And what it was the elements of user experience with products. This specifically was predictive reliability. It's a feature that already existed inside disk drives, a technology that allowed drives to have a signal they could send out to the computer using the disk drive that the drive was about to crash. And that sort of value is a Sloan thing. It isn't recording density or fly height or mechanics. It's a usefulness to the computer.
Now, this is pre-S.M.A.R.T or?
No, this is S.M.A.R.T. Well, what we worked on specifically was not the standard. It was an open standard for disk drives, for all the disk drives. They all have to meet just a few open standards, so you can put anybody manufacturer's disk drive in one of your computers. And in those standards was a S.M.A.R.T feature that allowed a signal to be sent to the computer itself that the drive was about to fail. Unfortunately, the method that the drive people selected to try to predict possible failures wasn't very good. You can almost imagine what they would be. The drives do make errors when you're recovering data, but they correct them. They have error correcting codes in their recording channels, and the disk drive is perfectly aware of how many times it's correcting. If it starts to have to correct too many errors, it might very well predict that it's about to fail due to a head crash or some such thing. And that's what they were doing, counting errors, and it just was not a very successful technology. If you talk to people about S.M.A.R.T, they'll say that it was put in at the request of one of the computer users, the Compaq computer company, but it wasn't very successful. And so we worked on better algorithms. We used non-paramagnetic statistics, and this work involved theory, simulation, mathematics, a number of students that worked with me, grad students and undergrads, a handful of students, I should say. And we tested these better methods for failure prediction using about 4,000 compact disk drives that had failed, come back to Compaq for failure analysis out of the tens of millions of disk drives they had manufactured. They gave us the data from about 4,000 of them that they had analyzed for errors. Usually, it's not commonly understood, but there's a failure analysis group in any disk drive company that gets returns from customers, and the surprising fact is that most of the disk drives work when they're tested. They aren't failed at all. Nobody quite knows how. So I had this data from Compact 4000, and we used it to verify these methods, which we published in the IEEE Journal on Reliability. And that was one of our major projects at CMRR.
Any others you'd like to mention?
I mentioned that I put thin film discs into use with conventional recording channels because didn't require additional research. But for the future, you want to consider unusual recording methods, and perpendicular recording finally did become possible because recording heads could be designed to record properly, and that happened several years ago. I decided I would work at CMRR on something that had no near future promise of production, but maybe it had future promise, and that was bit patterned media, where instead of a featureless uniform cobalt film over the disk, it would be spots of cobalt, each spot being 1 bit. And so I did theoretical work for a number of years at CMRR on recording channels suitable for bit pattern media and topics of that sort.
Do you have any feeling for when bit pattern media may actually happen in production?
I think in my own opinion, the answer is it's already here, and it will surprise you. The answer is that it'll be the industry that we think of as flash memory chips. Those are bit patterned. They're at very low density than magnetic disks. They are twice as expensive as magnetic disks per byte, but they are improving greatly because it's a lot of money in the industry that flash memory and solid state disks sell in, and that bit pattern disks will never happen in magnetic recording. They won't be able to compete against flash memory chips.
Okay. Any other projects at CMRR that you want to talk about? Maybe some that you consulted on that were in other parts of the group.
Secure Race.
Secure Race.
Yeah, Secure Race, remember that?
Oh. That's a little hard to explain, but it was another Sloan project originally. In all the industry that I've talked about, the idea is to store bits reliably on a disk and to get more and more of them onto that disk and to make sure that they're there when I want to read back the data successfully. Well, what happens when you want to dispose of a disk drive and your financial data is on it, your medical data, your history is on it, you want to erase the disk. So we had projects for several years on secure erase of disk drives, and it's not as it's more subtle than people realize. There's an industry feeling out there that people like Apple believe in, that all you got to do is, if you worry about your recorded data, all you have to do is overwrite it with some random data, or just overwrite it completely to erase it. And if you worry that it won't be successful, you just do it several times. And you worry about that, do it 30 times. Well, that turns out to be totally fallacious. And so we worked on establishing a proper method to secure erase disk drives. And again, CMRR was able to get a standard put into these open standards for disk drives, the so-called most common standard for today's disk drives. 99% of the production has in its open standard a command to securely erase the disk drive. And we worked on what the disk drive should actually do to make sure that the data is actually gone.
And this involves track edge effects and so forth?
It involves addressing the issues of track edge. If you look into this question of the fact that the recording heads can be slightly misaligned and not record exactly over the prior track that was already there, that maybe in the 1960s or 70s, the track densities were low enough that it was an issue, but it's of zero. It has zero consequence now. in today's track densities, which are very high. But the result of that was that, it's a part of the study, we studied all those effects, but additionally there are system level effects that result in some areas that are just not being recorded on at all. And system level problems are just as important as bit by bit problems. And the name of one of them that's of interest is the so-called host protected area on disk. That's often reserved by operating systems to store user backups and things of that nature, or diagnostic programs. But it is an area that won't be normally affected by a secure erase, and we did research on, we actually wrote software programs that people download, you can still download them, to erase your disk drive, and it makes sure that if there's a host protected area, that it eliminates it by means of software commands, and it erases that too.
But it doesn't hit the super tracks or the factory tracks, right? Where the map is stored and things like that.
No, if you did that, the disk drive wouldn't work anymore.
Right. Okay.
They're not accessible. What we're talking about is erasing all the so-called native data accessible tracks, including the host protected areas.
Right. User accessible.
Yeah, upper user acceptable. Hypothetically user acceptable.
Can you talk about some of the relationships that you had with various companies during your career at CMRR, for example, Seagate, IBM?
Well, one of my duties as associate director was to help get sponsors to support CMRR, so I would visit sponsors, including Seagate. Seagate by then had a division in, its main recording division was in Longmont, Colorado, so I visited them, gave talks. I visited IBM divisions, gave talks, and basically described the work that CMR was doing, its various research projects, and the students that would be available for employment soon.
So CMRR made many key contributions to hard drive technology. What are the key contributing factors to its success and its longevity? I mean, it's still there as a center.
Well, it was a sensible idea when it started. I'll say that this was a Jim Lemke idea. It's easier to explain. Jim had used the Semiconductor Industry Association as a model. They had started making chips, Fairchild and Texas Instruments, and what became Intel. It had grown into a large business making integrated circuit chips, memory chips, and had founded a series of research institutes to work on far-out technologies that the commercial companies wouldn't find profitable, and additionally to educate students into the technologies involved in making these chips to make a future source of employees for this industry. And he duplicated the entire process for disk drives. The result is we went to a number of universities, including Stanford, UCLA, and San Diego, to find the proper university that would welcome this institute, designed to educate students in technologies for tape, disk, any sort of information storage, including flash, and in all the engineering and physics disciplines that are involved, mechanics, electronics, hydrodynamics, magnetic physics, to specialize students in areas that would get them jobs in disk drive industry. That was true in the 1987s when this all started with disk drives, and it's still true today. Virtually all of these students that I'm aware of go into the recording industry, disk drive industry. And additionally, there's a number of more institutes. Research institutes now exist not only at UC San Diego, but University of Alabama. There's one in Singapore doing the same thing, educating students in the proper technologies for more and better products for the future.
Okay. What do you think were some of the key contributions that you made in the hard drive field over the many years in the industry?
Well, I would say that it's primarily the work on thin film discs. That's what got me an IEEE fellow, where it was really the thin film disc work in several different companies that I've discussed. I have to say that what I'm proudest of is designing recording channels for commercial disc drives that millions of people voluntarily buy. I just think that's neat.
Okay. What was the most satisfying of these?
Well, that's the most satisfying one. Well, my original research paper on statistical pattern recognition for theory work, and my job making better disk drive products happen faster and sooner.
Okay. You've trained many graduate students over the years for master's and PhD programs. How many graduate students approximately have come out of your group, and how many went into the data storage industry? And where did the others go if they didn't go into?
Yeah, I don't have records, but I'll say that it's about a dozen. They're mostly grad students, but I hired undergrads too, because the S.M.A.R.T work needed hands-on drive testing. That's not graduate level work. So I had hired undergrads to do drive testing, a number of grad students, I guess I'll say more than a half dozen, to do the work that we've discussed in this interview. And they're the funnest part of any university. The students are the funnest part of being at UCSD.
Is there a key philosophy or ground rules or strategy that you follow in terms of training and educating your students?
Well, I'm going to say that basically you want to tell them that anything's possible. Amazing new technologies are possible. You can wind up working for a job where you help millions of people in their lives with stuff that turns out to be valuable to them. But I have to say that the students are pretty smart. They seem to know that anyway. They don't seem to. What I told them was that you need to have the right education, and you've got to get the degree and get out and get a job, and that's what you want. But they seem to know that anyway.
Did you talk to students about the Seagate way, and would you talk to us about the Seagate way?
Well, as I say, when I went to Seagate, I was a researcher, and I had to understand teamwork. And then you need to educate new employees that you hire on teamwork. So I made a small, maybe it's a one-page series of mottos that just says.
These are in your book, by the way.
They're in the book. I guess the funnest one to explain is sneak around behind somebody, do him a favor, improve his job, deny all credit for it.
So did you talk to the students about this stuff, or?
No, I did not. Did not take them the Seagate way.
Okay. What did you look for in a student that you picked for your projects or programs, or accepted as a student?
Well, they're all reasonably bright, or you wouldn't be talking to them, and so you're just you're looking for somebody that either has the mathematical ability, sometimes it's the programming ability, and sometimes it's the electromechanical test capability to just do the work. And I guess it's rather similar to hiring somebody, but after you've done this for so many years, you sort of forget what you're doing. It's automatic.
Okay.
Attitude and aptitude is what it is.
Are there any particular former students that you would like to comment about, where they work now or what they're doing?
Well, the single smartest one was Joe Murray. He's a physics student. Absolutely brilliant. All the things I just described that are useful talents, he did all of them. Quite remarkable. Great attitude, really brilliant guy. Unfortunately, there was a tendency, at least a few years ago when this is happening, when the financial community was snapping up physics students to do what they call quantitative predictions of what the stock market or a stock is doing. And so Joe wound up working for a financial company, and I wasn't surprised at all a year later when he wound up working in the data storage industry. I don't recall exactly where he is, but he wound up last I heard of him, he was in the data storage industry. We still get requests for this paper, several papers that we published in this S.M.A.R.T program on disk drive predictive reliability.
And he was involved in that?
He was the best student I had in that, yeah.
All right. Do you have any other favorite stories about the industry or the people that you haven't mentioned that you'd like to?
Well, not that comes to mind.
Okay. Are there any other people that you haven't mentioned that had a big influence on you?
I mentioned Lemke, who not only got me, I believe he got me my Seagate job. I believe he got me as associate director of CMRR, and I know he got me interested in small airplane flying, which became one of the major excitement adventures of my lifetime. 45 years of owning small airplanes. That was started by Lemke also.
Yeah, we should point out that you have over 5,000 hours, and that
5,300 hours of flying.
And Seagate let you fly on business, right?
That was one of the stories. Another Al Shugart story. I wanted to talk to Al after I got this job offer from Doug Mann, and they were in Las Vegas. At that time, there was a yearly convention called Comdex, which was hugely successful, and Seagate was there because it was disk drives. And so I flew my airplane to Las Vegas to see Al, to make sure that a research guy like me would be welcome in a disk drive technology. It's sort of funny laughing at this now. I was a pretty naive guy. Would I be welcome? I guess from what I thought, that was a reasonable question to ask. And I found Al down at the craps table. He was down by $70,000, but he didn't bother him at all. His answer to my questions, I asked him if I would be welcome, and then I asked him if I could fly my small airplane on Seagate's business, which was, I was able to do it at Xerox, but it was very difficult to avoid the legal department catching me. But Al said I could do it. And occasionally I had to remind the Seagate financial people of that promise. And when I left, he was back at the crap table, and he was not down by $100,000. He was up by about $70,000. It was rather amazing to watch. Not just the money involved, but the fact that it didn't bother him any more or less being up than it had been being down. It was quite amazing.
That's a good story. So, in all this time you were flying your plane, how much time did you fly on business, and compared to how much for pleasure?
Well, during the Seagate years, I would say that maybe a third of my flying was on business, of the hours.
Can you talk about some of the places that you flew? And by the way, we should point out that you flew a Mooney, a turbocharged Mooney that was capable of flying in the flight levels.
I once was on the radio reporting to air traffic control that I was at flight level 230, which is 23,000 feet. And there was a gravelly voice that came on the radio from a jet who asked me what kind of a Mooney would be up at 23,000 feet. And I said, well, that's a turbo Mooney. I can go up to 25 or 26,000 feet. You have to have an oxygen system to do that. But I was pretty pleased with myself, I guess. I don't know why, but I was pretty pleased with myself. So I flew this Mooney, and earlier a Cessna 182, over pretty much most of North American continent. Canada, Montreal, the Bahamas once, Mexico, as far as south as Oaxaca, tip of Florida, Seattle, around the Alcan Highway once. Pretty much most of North America.
All right. What are you most proud of in your career?
I have to say, when all is said and done, it's the pleasure of helping to make disk drives commercially successful to a point where millions of people to buy them voluntarily and pay money for them. That's very satisfying.
What are you doing now?
Mostly traveling. My wife and I are going to Iceland in July.
Could I ask why you picked Iceland?
Well, I've been almost everywhere else. been to Antarctica, what's left? Iceland. I've been to Alaska. Been around Alaska several times.
Did you fly the Mooney?
Flew the Mooney to Alaska with another Mooney, right. We got as far north as Barrow, north of the Arctic Circle, where we had this is August. We had northern lights. It was very light, almost light until midnight.
So I know you've just recently sold your Mooney. What are your other passions or hobbies or interests?
Well, I've taken an interest in financial investing. It's fun. It's a fun hobby, and it has the advantage you can make money with it. And so I enjoy. Right now, the enjoyment is making sure that you're getting out of bonds, because interest rates are about to rise due to inflation starting. And it's sort of a fun game of staying ahead of the other guy.
Are you using your mathematical skills for that?
Doesn't take very advanced math. But it takes system. It's a system analysis thing. I mentioned the Minuteman missile program. By looking at the entire missile, I was able to find a problem near the tail of the missile where they weren't looking. And the same is true of financial analysis. If you listen and watch and get some experience doing all this, you can follow the markets so that you don't get badly burned before you turn to a different form of investing, stocks instead of bonds, or dividend stocks instead of power stocks.
Okay. If you could do it over, what would you change?
I would have married my wife Shirley earlier, a couple of years earlier. That would be it.
Want to comment why?
Well, I married her because I had to leave Los Angeles. My job at Xerox had ended. The park had closed my lab. I was going to work for Seagate, and rather than lose her, I married her. But I was sort of stupid. I should have married her years earlier.
Okay. We've talked a little bit about flash versus rotating storage here. Basically, the rotating storage is being replaced in many applications by solid state at an increasing pace. Do you have any prediction about where hard drives will be in the future? Is there still a place for hard drives? And will they continue to survive, and if so, for how long?
Well, flash is first took up the marketplace for, let's call them small diameter disk drives, 1-inch disk drives. That happened some years ago. It was very easy to make flash more capable and less expensive than very small diameter disk drives. It probably will take over I'll say the 2.5-inch disk drive market. It's hard to say, but what it will take is at the modest performance, modest cost PC market. Flash is about twice as expensive per megabyte or gigabyte than disk, and it's not important if you only need a few terabytes. And so flash will take up most of that market. It also has a place in large server farms, large servers as staging devices. But what's behind all the large systems, including the internet itself, large database storage is on disks and probably will remain that way for the foreseeable future. The entirety of the world's internet is in fact on rotating magnetic disks, not on flash. And as long as the disk retains its ability to provide twice as many bytes for the buck, as I put it, as flash, it will stay that way. For very expensive computing, flash is coming. So disk drives have to stay low cost and very large capacity.
Okay.
Terabytes.
What vision do you have for the future of computing and storage?
Well, there are several Stone Age technology elements to computing that have never changed. It's true that the punch cards that I used in at Caltech in my graduate thesis have been replaced by keyboards, but keyboards are a terrible way to put information into a computer. So keyboards will go. Keyboards have to go. I sort of think that visible displays ought to go too. We should have some kind of a telepathic kind of a hat with wires in it that you put on your head and compute. But and we have to get rid of passwords and usernames. They're the evil of our day.
Amen.
The first thing that has to happen is get rid of passwords.
So, what are the key challenges you see ahead for the computing industry and technology in general?
Well, that's an interesting and very broad question. What's wrong with the I'll put it this way: the computers have always been driven in a direction towards user friendliness, and it probably will turn fatal. I'm speaking of things like foreign hacking of the U.S. electoral system, for example. There has to be privacy on the internet is now almost non-existent, and that can't stand. There has to be some way to put a reasonable privacy, and it has to be available to ordinary people. If a company like, Equifax Credit Bureau can't protect its usernames, how is an ordinary person going to be protected from having his computer used as a botnet, as part of a bot network when he's not using it? It has to be fixed. I would say that the problem is not the megabytes or the megaflops or any of the electronics or the operating system. The problem is basically the user interface, especially the security. And when we get the security, we won't have to have passwords, will we?
Exactly. What advice would you give to a young person starting out in their career?
Go into disk drive or go into data storage, including flash, solid state, and magnetic rotating even tape. Go into disk drive research. You may not get as much respect as Intel's and its chips, Intel Inside stuff, but it's a great occupation.
Okay. Any other comments or thoughts or anything else you want to?
Oh, I think that's all I've got.
Okay. I'm going to circle back then a little bit and ask you about alluvial phantom.
Well, I was an undergrad at Caltech, living in one of the student houses called Fleming, and I had picked up for some reason the Popular Mechanics magazine, and I came across an ad that was popular then. This is the middle of 1950s. The ad was for the Rosicrucians, which is a museum of sorts here in San Jose area. And it said I could send away for a booklet called The Mastery of Life, something about the Knights Templar. Well, I thought that would be sort of fun, sort of stupid, I realized, but and so I didn't want to use my real name. So I sent away this little coupon for a copy of this book on the mastery of life, and I had to invent a name. I'd been taking geology class at Caltech, and so I thought of the name alluvial fan, which is a geological dirt pile, name for a dirt pile, and so I used the name alluvial Fanson. And since I've graduated from Caltech, alumni get invited back once a year in May to have an alumni day. We hear talks about what the researchers are doing. We get to see the students. And I discovered that a long time ago, way after I left Caltech, that alluvial still had his own mail slot at Fleming House, alluvial Fanson, and he was still getting mail. And I looked into this. I asked the Fleming House guys, and I discovered that alluvial had a driver's license, he had a car license, he'd been in the Army and been distinguished discharge, and he had a wife. I never quite knew what the wife's name, but maybe Alluvia Fanson. And so I went back, every year since that I went back, I looked for alluvial's mailbox, and it only vanished this last year because none of the mailboxes are in use anymore. Somehow there's no mail if it's all email.
Okay. Any other fun stories?
None that are printable.
None that are printable. Okay, I think we're done.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Gordon.